Some debts are paid with gold, but the oldest ones always come back wearing a human face. The trading post smelled of leather, dust, and old cedar smoke drifting through warped wooden beams as the afternoon sun settled low over the Arizona territory. Horses shifted impatiently outside, their reins creaking in the dry wind while tired ranchers argued over cattle, tools, and sacks of grain. Silas Bennett had come for a simple reason. His ranch had survived another brutal season, but barely. Half his fence needed replacing, 2 horses had gone lame, and every dollar he owned already belonged to somebody else. He wasn't looking for trouble. He certainly wasn't looking for another mouth to feed. Yet trouble often arrived quietly, wearing ordinary clothes. "You still owe $28, the merchant reminded him, folding a weathered ledger shut. "You don't have the cash." Silas gave a tired nod. "Then take another month." The merchant laughed without humor. "I don't sell time." For several seconds neither man spoke. The only sound came from a loose shutter tapping against the building in the afternoon breeze. Then the merchant glanced toward the rear of the yard where several figures stood behind a rough wooden fence. "I might have another arrangement." Silas followed his eyes. At first he noticed only worn blankets, faded clothing, and a few silent people waiting beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree. Then he saw her. She stood completely still while everyone else shifted their weight from the heat. Dust covered her boots and the hem of her faded dress, but nothing could hide the strange dignity in the way she carried herself. Her hands rested calmly before her instead of hanging in defeat. Her dark eyes never searched for pity. They simply watched everything. "Apache girl," the merchant said casually. "Quiet, strong, doesn't cause problems. You take responsibility for her debt, and yours disappears." Silas frowned. "She's a person. She's a contract," the merchant corrected. "One signed long before today." The young woman never interrupted. She never pleaded. She never looked frightened. If anything, she looked strangely patient, as though she had already accepted something no one else understood. Silas found that harder to ignore than tears would have been. He stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. She slowly raised her eyes to meet his. They were calm, steady, and impossibly unreadable. Most people lowered their gaze when strangers judged them. She did not. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't pride. It felt older than either. Around her neck, partly hidden beneath the worn collar of her dress, something turquoise caught a single ray of sunlight before disappearing again beneath the fabric. It lasted less than a heartbeat, yet Silas couldn't explain why the tiny flash stayed in his mind. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. She answered after a long silence. "Kaya." Her English was careful and clear, carrying only the faintest trace of an Apache accent. Nothing more. No explanation. No request. The merchant shrugged impatiently. "Decide. I've got buyers heading north before sunset." Silas looked once more at the young woman who stood with the quiet composure of someone refusing to surrender the last thing no chain could ever hold. He reached into his saddlebag, removed the folded debt papers, and placed them on the merchant's desk. "Tear them up," he said. The merchant smiled as if he had won the easiest bargain of his life. Kaya lowered her eyes for the first time, not in submission, but as though she had just heard the opening line of a story whose ending even she could not yet see. Neither man noticed the elderly Apache traveler standing across the street beside a water trough. The old man's weathered face turned pale the instant he recognized the turquoise pendant hidden beneath Kaya's collar. His lips parted, but no words came. He simply removed his hat, lowered his head, and whispered into the desert wind. "The chief's daughter has finally been found." The ride back to the Bennett Ranch took nearly 3 hours beneath a sky that stretched so wide it made every rider seem smaller than the secrets they carried. Dry grass rolled across the hills in waves, bending beneath the steady western wind while distant hawks circled above the sandstone ridges. Silas spoke only when the trail demanded it. Kaya answered only when necessary. The silence between them never felt uncomfortable. It felt measured, almost respectful, as though both understood that words spent too early often lost their value. When the ranch finally appeared beyond a line of cottonwoods, it looked exactly as it always had. A weathered cabin, a leaning barn, corrals patched with different shades of old lumber. Nothing impressive, nothing grand. Yet Kaya studied every fence post, every water barrel, every grazing horse with careful attention instead of disappointment. She climbed down from her horse without waiting for help, dusted her skirt, and quietly carried 2 heavy grain sacks toward the barn before Silas could even tell her where they belonged. He watched for a moment, surprised. Most newcomers wandered uncertainly across unfamiliar ground. Kaya moved as though she already understood the rhythm of working land. Before sunset, she had organized the feed room, swept years of loose hay from one corner of the stable, and repaired a broken water bucket using nothing more than rawhide strips left forgotten on a shelf. She never asked permission to work. She simply noticed what needed doing. The following morning, Silas woke before sunrise, expecting to begin the chores alone as always. Instead, he found fresh water already waiting beside the horses. The barn door stood open just enough to catch the cool morning breeze without startling the livestock. Coffee simmered quietly above the stove. Kaya stood outside facing the eastern horizon where the first light spilled across the prairie. Her hands rested gently against the weathered fence rail, her expression calm enough to make the endless land itself seem quieter. Silas poured coffee into 2 tin cups and walked toward her. "You did not have to start before daylight," he said. Kaya accepted the cup with a slight nod. "The horses wake before the sun. They should not have to wait for people." Her answer carried no pride, only simple certainty. Later that afternoon, a stubborn bay mare refused every ranch hand who tried to replace a loose horseshoe. The animal tossed its head and stepped away each time someone approached. Without saying a word, Kaya walked slowly toward the mare with empty hands. She stopped several feet away and remained perfectly still. The mare lifted its ears, sniffed the air, then quietly closed the distance on its own. Kaya rested one hand against its neck and whispered a few soft words in Apache. The restless horse lowered its head almost immediately. Every man in the yard stopped working. One of the older ranch hands scratched his beard. "That mare has not trusted anybody for 6 months," he muttered. Silas simply watched. It would have been easy to call it luck. Yet similar moments continued appearing every day. A frightened calf wandered back to the herd after Kaya found fresh tracks no one else had noticed. A broken wagon wheel lasted another week because she strengthened the cracked spokes with woven strips of soaked rawhide. Even the lonely ranch seemed somehow quieter, steadier, as though it recognized someone who understood how to listen before acting. That evening, while folding a worn blanket inside the cabin, Silas noticed the turquoise pendant slip briefly from beneath Kaya's collar. She tucked it away almost instantly, but not before he caught sight of an intricate carving unlike anything he had ever seen. "It looks valuable," he said. Kaya's fingers rested protectively over the hidden stone. "Its value cannot be measured with money." Before Silas could ask another question, distant hoofbeats drifted across the valley, faint enough to disappear with the wind. Yet Kaya's calm expression changed for the first time since he had met her. She did not look frightened. She looked prepared. The hoofbeats never came any closer that evening, and by the time darkness settled across the valley, the only sounds left were crickets hidden in the tall grass and the slow breathing of horses inside the barn. Silas said nothing about what he had noticed in Kaya's face. He had spent enough years alone to recognize when another person carried memories too heavy for ordinary conversation. The next several days passed with the steady rhythm of ranch life. Fences needed mending. Cattle wandered farther than they should. Windmills demanded constant attention. Yet something subtle had begun to change. The ranch no longer felt like a place merely surviving one season after another. It felt alive again. Even the hired hands, men who rarely agreed on anything, quietly admitted that work seemed easier somehow. Nobody could explain why. They simply noticed that fewer things went wrong whenever Kaya happened to be nearby. One cool morning, Silas discovered fresh tracks leading toward the northern pasture. At first glance, they looked like ordinary deer prints crossing the trail, but Kaya crouched beside them for only a moment before gently brushing away a thin layer of dust. Beneath it appeared the deeper marks of 3 stray cattle that had broken away during the night. "They crossed the creek," she said softly. Silas studied the ground and frowned. "I cannot even see the prints." Kaya smiled faintly without lifting her eyes. The wind tried to hide them. It did not finish the job. They followed her directions for nearly 2 miles before finding every missing animal grazing peacefully beside a stand of cottonwood trees. One of the ranch hands removed his hat and stared at the ground in disbelief. I rode right through here before sunrise, he whispered. I missed every sign. Kaya only shrugged as if she had done nothing unusual. Later that afternoon, a traveling merchant stopped by to trade flour and lamp oil. The moment he saw Kaya carrying buckets toward the well, his cheerful expression faltered. He looked at her only briefly before lowering his gaze. As he climbed back onto his wagon, he touched 2 fingers against his forehead in a gesture Silas had never seen before. Kaya answered with the slightest nod, almost too small to notice. The merchant drove away without another word. Do you know him? Silas asked after the wagon disappeared beyond the ridge. No, Kaya answered. Then why did he greet you like that? She looked toward the empty road where the wagon had vanished into shimmering heat. Some people remember old customs longer than they remember old faces. The answer raised more questions than it settled. That evening, another stranger arrived. This time, an elderly Apache man carrying bundles of dried herbs across the desert. His weathered horse stopped without being asked the instant it reached the ranch gate. The old traveler glanced toward Kaya. For a single heartbeat, surprise flashed across his face before he slowly stepped down from the saddle. Silas expected conversation. Instead, the old man quietly removed his hat and placed his closed hand over his heart. Kaya responded by lowering her eyes respectfully. No words passed between them. The silence itself seemed to carry meaning. After accepting fresh water for his horse, the traveler thanked Silas politely and continued south before sunset. You have never met him either? Silas asked. Kaya shook her head. Not by name. Yet he treated you as though you were someone important. A gentle breeze lifted a loose strand of her dark hair as she turned toward the fading light. Sometimes respect is given to what a family protects, not only to the family itself. That night, long after the lantern had burned low, Silas unfolded an old territory map across his kitchen table. His eyes wandered until they rested upon a name written near the mountains to the east. Greyhawk Territory. He had heard the stories as a boy. A proud Apache tribe that had vanished years ago after a broken agreement with settlers. As he quietly rolled the map closed, he never noticed Kaya standing outside beneath the stars, her turquoise pendant resting openly in her hands while she whispered a promise into the desert wind that she intended to keep, no matter what tomorrow brought. The following morning arrived beneath a pale sky washed clean by the cool desert wind, and for the first time in years Silas postponed his chores. The folded territory map still rested on the kitchen table beside an old iron lantern, refusing to leave his thoughts. Greyhawk Territory. The words lingered in his mind long after the coffee had grown cold. He crossed the room to an aging cedar chest tucked beneath the window, a box he had not opened since his father passed away nearly 8 years earlier. Dust settled across its lid like forgotten seasons. The hinges groaned softly as he lifted it open. Inside rested worn tools, faded family photographs, an old cavalry canteen, and a leather journal wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Silas hesitated before opening it. His father, Thomas Bennett, had rarely spoken about the years before building the ranch. Whenever neighbors mentioned old conflicts between settlers and Apache tribes, the older man usually fell silent and found another reason to leave the conversation. At the time, Silas had assumed those memories simply belonged to another generation. Now they seemed to be waiting for him inside the cracked leather cover. The handwriting was steady but sparse, recording weather, cattle prices, and miles traveled. Several pages later, the entries changed. One date had been underlined twice. Below it were only a few sentences. Rode east under orders to witness the peace meeting. It should have ended differently. Some men wanted land more than peace. We left carrying supplies and returned carrying regret. Silas read the lines again. They revealed almost nothing, yet somehow said everything. Another page had been folded inward for years. When he carefully opened it, a dried sprig of desert sage slipped onto the table. Beneath it his father had written, "If my son ever reads this, remember one thing. A broken promise lives longer than the man who breaks it." Silas slowly closed his eyes. Outside, he could hear Kaya moving quietly through the yard, filling water troughs before the horses finished their morning feed. He stepped onto the porch holding the journal loosely in one hand. Kaya looked up for only a moment before returning to her work. "Have you ever heard of Greyhawk Territory?" he asked. Her hand stopped moving. The bucket rope creaked gently against the wooden well as silence settled between them. After several long seconds, she answered without turning around. Every Apache child has heard that name. Silas rested one shoulder against the porch post. My father was there. Kaya remained still. Was he? Her voice carried no accusation, only quiet curiosity. I think he witnessed something he regretted for the rest of his life. At last she faced him. Her expression revealed neither anger nor forgiveness. Only patience. Regret is honest, she said softly. But it does not change what happened. Those words stayed with Silas throughout the afternoon. He found himself studying his father in a different light, wondering how many quiet kindnesses the old man had offered strangers simply because he had once failed someone he could never repay. As sunset painted the mesas with deep shades of amber and crimson, a rider appeared at the far edge of the valley. He did not approach the ranch. He merely stopped upon a distant ridge where the fading light outlined both horse and rider against the evening sky. Even from nearly half a mile away, Kaya recognized the figure instantly. She stood motionless beside the barn, one hand resting over the hidden turquoise pendant beneath her collar. The rider slowly raised an eagle feather toward the horizon before turning his horse and disappearing beyond the western hills. Silas had only seen a silhouette. Kaya had seen a message. And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, she whispered to herself, "They know where I am now." The eagle feather haunted Silas long after the rider disappeared beyond the western ridge. It was not the feather itself that unsettled him. It was the expression on Kaya's face. Until that evening she had carried every burden with quiet steadiness, but now there was something different behind her calm eyes. Not fear. Expectation. As though a door she had hoped would remain closed had finally begun to open. 3 mornings later the ranch awoke beneath heavy gray clouds that promised rain, but delivered only wind. The horses grew restless before sunrise, lifting their heads toward the southern trail long before any human ear detected approaching riders. Kaya paused while hanging fresh laundry outside the cabin. She closed her eyes for a single heartbeat, listening. "Someone is coming," she said quietly. Silas looked across the empty valley. "I do not see anyone." "You will." Less than 10 minutes later 3 riders emerged from a curtain of blowing dust. Their horses were well fed. Their saddles were expensive. Their polished boots looked strangely clean for men traveling through open country. The oldest of the 3 removed his hat as they approached the ranch house. His smile arrived before his words. "Morning," he called pleasantly. "We are looking for a young Apache woman." Silas stepped onto the porch without reaching for the rifle hanging beside the door. "There are many Apache women in the territory." The stranger chuckled politely. "Not this one." He unfolded a worn piece of paper from inside his coat. The sketch bore only a rough likeness, but it was enough. Kaya quietly stood beside the well without attempting to hide. "Her name is Kaya," the man continued. "She disappeared several weeks ago after running away from a lawful labor contract. We have traveled a long way to bring her back." Silas glanced toward Kaya. She remained silent, her hands folded calmly before her. "Did you run away?" he asked. She answered with the same honesty she had shown since arriving. "I left." "Did anyone force you?" She looked directly into his eyes. Would my answer matter to them? The 3 riders exchanged quick glances, but said nothing. The oldest man reached into a saddlebag and produced a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it gently onto the porch. Silver coins clinked together inside. $50, he offered. "Twice what she is worth on paper. Keep the money. Let us take the girl." Silas stared at the pouch without touching it. $50 would repair every fence on the ranch, replace the broken wagon axle, and leave enough to purchase another horse before winter. It was more money than he usually saw in several months. The wind pushed dry leaves across the yard while nobody spoke. Finally Silas looked at Kaya. She stood exactly where she had always stood, straight-backed, quiet, and waiting. She did not beg him to refuse. She did not ask him to help. She simply trusted him to choose. Silas bent down, picked up the leather pouch, walked slowly toward the visitors, and placed it back into the oldest rider's hands. "You should keep your money," he said evenly. The man's smile faded. "Perhaps you did not understand my offer." "I understood it perfectly." Silas's voice remained calm. "But I do not buy people. I do not sell them either." The youngest rider shifted uneasily in his saddle. "You are making this difficult." "No," Silas answered. "Whoever decided another human being could be treated like property made it difficult long before I arrived." For the first time since meeting him, Kaya's expression softened ever so slightly. It was not relief. It was respect. The oldest rider studied Silas for several long moments before slipping the pouch back into his coat. "Very well," he said quietly. "We will leave today." He adjusted his reins and looked once toward Kaya. "But understand this. Others are already riding. They are far more interested in who she truly is than in what they can sell her for." Without another word, the three men turned their horses and disappeared into the swirling dust, leaving behind only hoofprints and a silence that suddenly felt far heavier than before. Long after the three riders disappeared beyond the rolling hills, their words remained behind like dust settling into the cracks of old wood. "Others are already riding. They are far more interested in who she truly is." Silas repeated the sentence quietly while repairing a loose fence rail near the southern pasture. It made no sense. If Kaya had truly escaped an ordinary labor contract, why would strangers travel across half the territory searching for her with money instead of warrants? Why would every Apache elder who crossed her path greet her with silent respect? And why had his own father written about Gray Hawk territory with words heavy enough to outlive a lifetime? That evening, the desert finally surrendered a light rain. It lasted barely 20 minutes, just enough to darken the earth and leave the air carrying the clean scent of wet sage. Kaya stepped outside after the clouds drifted east, lifting her face toward the fading sky as though welcoming an old friend. Silas noticed something glimmering beneath her collar again. This time the turquoise pendant had slipped farther into view than before. Fine silver lines surrounded the polished stone, forming an intricate pattern that resembled the wings of an eagle spreading across the morning sun. It was unlike any piece of jewelry he had ever seen in trading posts or settlements. "That pendant," he said quietly. "It belongs to your family, does it not?" Kaya rested her fingers over it instinctively. For several moments, she did not answer. The only sound came from rainwater dripping slowly from the barn roof onto the thirsty ground below. "It belonged to someone who trusted me," she finally replied. Silas studied her expression. "Someone still living?" Her eyes drifted toward the distant mountains where darkness slowly gathered between the cliffs. "I pray so." Before he could ask another question, the old ranch dog barked once and trotted toward the front gate. An elderly traveler stood there holding the reins of a tired gray horse. His weathered buckskin coat carried the smell of cedar smoke and desert wind. Silas recognized him immediately. He was the same Apache elder who had accepted water several days earlier. "Good evening," the old man said warmly. "My horse remembers your well better than I remember the trail." Silas smiled and invited him inside for supper. During the meal, the elder spoke mostly about weather, rivers, and the coming winter. He asked polite questions about cattle and crops, yet his eyes occasionally rested upon Kaya with quiet affection that seemed impossible to hide. As the meal ended, Kaya rose to refill his cup. The pendant slipped free once more, catching the lantern light. The old man's hands froze around the tin cup. Without hesitation, he slowly stood to his feet. Then, to Silas's complete surprise, he lowered his head and placed his right hand over his heart in a gesture far deeper than ordinary respect. Kaya immediately stepped forward and gently raised his hand before anyone else could notice. "Please," she whispered softly in Apache. "Not here." The elder nodded with understanding, but before leaving, he turned towards Silas. "Some treasures are protected because they are valuable," he said. "Others are valuable because someone chose to protect them." Silas watched the old man disappear into the moonlit valley until both horse and rider vanished into the silver darkness. When he turned back toward the cabin, he found Kaya standing alone beside the porch, the turquoise pendant resting openly in her palm for the first time. She looked down at the worn stone with quiet sadness before closing her fingers around it once more. Neither of them noticed that, far across the valley, dozens of distant campfires had begun appearing one by one beneath the shadow of the eastern mountains, too many to belong to wandering travelers and arranged with a discipline that only an organized people would understand. The campfires remained on the eastern horizon through the night, glowing like quiet stars that had settled upon the earth instead of the sky. By sunrise they were gone, leaving only empty ridges and unanswered questions. Silas saddled his horse before dawn, intending to ride toward the upper pasture, but he stopped the moment he stepped outside. Every horse in the corral stood perfectly still with their ears pointed toward the valley entrance. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Kaya walked slowly from the barn, carrying a bucket of fresh water. She looked only once toward the distant trail before setting the bucket gently upon the ground. "They are here," she said. Silas followed her gaze. At first he saw nothing except shimmering morning light rising above the desert floor. Then shapes began to appear through the haze. Riders, one after another, then more behind them. They did not gallop. They advanced at a calm, measured pace that carried neither panic nor aggression. Sunlight reflected from polished bridles, woven blankets, and eagle feathers moving gently in the breeze. Before long the line stretched farther than Silas could count. More than 300 Apache riders entered the valley in complete silence, stopping nearly 100 yards from the ranch house. No voices, no raised weapons, no threats, only stillness. The sight alone carried more weight than shouting ever could. The lead rider sat upon a magnificent gray horse whose age matched the deep lines upon his weathered face. His long silver hair rested across finely beaded buckskin, and around his shoulders hung a traditional mantle decorated with carefully placed feathers that shimmered softly beneath the morning sun. Silas instinctively removed his hat. Something about the older man's presence demanded respect before a single word had been spoken. The elder slowly dismounted. Every Apache rider behind him remained mounted without moving an inch. Kaya stepped forward. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, her calm expression softened into something deeply personal. The older man walked the remaining distance alone. When only a few feet separated them, Silas expected an embrace. Instead, the elder placed one hand gently over his heart and bowed his head. "My daughter," he said quietly. The words drifted across the silent valley like the first drop of rain after years of drought. Kaya lowered her own head before stepping forward and embracing him with quiet dignity. No tears, no dramatic cries, only the unmistakable comfort of two people finally standing where they had always belonged. Confusion swept across the ranch hands watching from beside the barn. Silas remained frozen where he stood. "Daughter." The word echoed louder inside his mind than the hoofbeats of 300 horses. The elder turned toward him with calm eyes that revealed both wisdom and immeasurable patience. "I am Chief Nan Black Hawk," he said, "leader of the Gray Hawk people." Silas felt the world shift beneath his boots. His father had written that name. The old territory map had carried that name. Every unanswered question suddenly pointed toward the man now standing before him. Chief Black Hawk looked toward Kaya once more before speaking again. "She is not simply my daughter. She is the one chosen to guide our people after me." The turquoise pendant slipped from beneath Kaya's collar as a gentle breeze lifted the edge of her dress. Sunlight struck the carved stone with brilliant color. Instantly, every Apache rider lowered his head in perfect unison. Hundreds of proud warriors offered the same silent gesture of honor to the young woman whom strangers had believed was nothing more than an ordinary servant. Silas looked from the pendant to Kaya, remembering every quiet chore she had completed, every horse she had calmed, every elder who had greeted her without explanation. The truth had been standing beside him from the very beginning. And as the silence settled once more across the valley, Chief Black Hawk lifted his eyes toward Silas and spoke words that carried neither anger nor accusation. "There is something about your family that you deserve to know before this day is over." Chief Nanton Black Hawk waited until the last whisper of wind faded across the valley before speaking again. None of the warriors moved. None interrupted. Even the horses seemed to understand that this moment belonged to words rather than strength. Silas stood quietly with his father's leather journal still tucked beneath one arm, suddenly realizing it had never been chance that brought Kaya to his ranch. The chief looked toward the distant hills before returning his gaze to Silas. "Many winters ago," he began, "our people met with several ranchers and traders to end years of distrust. We believed both sides wished to build a future where children could cross these valleys without fear." His weathered face remained calm, yet every sentence carried the weight of memory. Not everyone came seeking peace. Silas slowly lowered his eyes. He already knew what his father had written. He only did not know how much of it was true. Chief Black Hawk continued. "Some men arrived with honest hearts. Others arrived believing that promises could be exchanged for land." The chief paused, then surprised everyone by looking directly at the worn journal beneath Silas's arm. Your father was one of the honest men. Silas lifted his head in disbelief. He was there? He was. The chief nodded gently. When he realized the agreement had been betrayed by others, he tried to stop what followed. He helped several of our elders escape the confusion that day. One of them carried my infant daughter for many miles before returning her safely to our family. Kaya quietly closed her eyes. She had heard the story as a child, but never knew the name of the rancher who had chosen compassion when it would have been easier to remain silent. Chief Blackhawk looked at Silas once more. Your father carried regret because he believed he had not done enough. But among my people, we remembered the man who chose conscience instead of comfort. Silas felt his throat tighten. For years he had believed the Bennett family carried only the shadow of an old mistake. Now he discovered that history had been far more complicated than guilt alone. Why did you never tell me? He asked softly, looking toward Kaya. She smiled with quiet sadness. Because I wanted to know who you were before you knew who I was. Those words settled over the valley more deeply than any silence before them. She stepped forward until she stood beside her father, yet her eyes never left Silas. If I had arrived wearing the clothes of a chief's daughter, you would have treated me with honor because of my name. Instead, you treated me with honor when you believed I had none. No one spoke after that. The truth needed no decoration. One of the older warriors slowly dismounted and approached the chief. He spoke only a few words in Apache before stepping back again. Chief Blackhawk nodded thoughtfully. Some among my people believe the Bennett name should forever remind us of broken trust, he said. Others remembered only the man who protected strangers when no one was watching. He looked first at Kaya, then at Silas. Today my daughter must decide which memory deserves to live longer. Every pair of eyes turned toward Kaya. Hundreds of warriors waited without a sound. The ranch hands held their breath. Silas himself said nothing because he understood that no explanation he could offer would carry more meaning than the choice she was about to make. Kaya slowly removed the turquoise pendant from around her neck and held it gently between both hands. The stone reflected the bright desert sun as she took one measured step forward, standing not beside her father and not beside Silas, but exactly between the two worlds that had shaped her life. Kaya stood beneath the endless western sky with the turquoise pendant resting quietly in her open hands while every eye remained fixed upon her. The morning breeze carried the scent of sage across the valley, gently stirring the eagle feathers worn by the waiting warriors and the faded brim of Silas Bennett's old hat. For several long moments, she said nothing. Then she closed her fingers around the pendant and slowly turned toward her father. When I was a little girl, she said softly, you taught me that a leader does not choose the path that feels easiest. A leader chooses the path that leaves the children with fewer reasons to hate each other. Chief Nanton Blackhawk listened without interrupting. His weathered face revealed the quiet pride of a father watching his daughter become exactly the person she had been raised to become. Kaya then turned toward Silas. When I arrived here, you believed I was someone with no family, no name, and no place in this world. You could have treated me as others had. Instead, you offered work instead of chains, respect instead of pity, and trust before questions. You never honored my title. You honored my humanity. A deep silence settled across the ranch. The hired hands lowered their eyes. Even those who had known Silas for years seemed to understand him differently. Kaya walked forward until she stood only a few feet away from him. She lifted the turquoise pendant and gently placed it into his hands. Keep this until your final day, she said. Not because it belongs to you, but because it will remind every generation after yours that one act of kindness can heal a wound that regret alone never could. Silas looked down at the stone resting in his rough, calloused palm. I cannot accept something so precious. Kaya smiled gently. You already did. The day you chose to see a stranger as a person. Chief Blackhawk stepped forward beside his daughter. He looked across the valley toward his waiting people before speaking with calm authority. The Greyhawk Nation remembers every promise that was broken. We also remember every promise that was kept. Today the Bennett name will no longer be spoken with sorrow. It will be remembered with gratitude. As one, hundreds of Apache warriors placed their hands over their hearts. No drums sounded. No voices rose. Their silent gesture carried more honor than any celebration could have offered. Silas removed his hat and bowed his head, overwhelmed by a gift he knew he had never expected to receive. Before noon the riders prepared to leave. Kaya embraced her father, then mounted the horse waiting beside him. She looked once more toward the little ranch that had become an unexpected turning point in two families' histories. "Will I ever see you again?" Silas asked quietly. Kaya looked toward the wide horizon where the desert met the mountains in a ribbon of golden light. "The world is smaller after forgiveness," she answered. "The roads have a way of crossing again." With that, the long line of riders began moving eastward, disappearing gradually into the shimmering distance until only drifting dust remained beneath the afternoon sun. Weeks later, travelers passing through the territory noticed something new hanging above the entrance to the Bennett Ranch. It was not a trophy. It was not a weapon. It was a simple turquoise pendant catching the morning light, reminding every visitor that dignity could never be bought, that honor could never be inherited, and that the strongest bridge between two worlds was built by the quiet courage to treat a stranger as if they already belonged. Out on the old frontier, justice did not always arrive on horseback. Sometimes it arrived in silence, stayed only long enough to change a human heart, and rode away leaving the world gentler than